Picture this. You're a 10-year-old girl playing with your dolls in the courtyard of your family's home in ancient Rome. The morning sun filters through the columns as your mother hums while weaving nearby. Your father discusses business with visiting clients. It's an ordinary day in 57 BCE until the sound of ceremonial horns echoes through your neighborhood. The Pontifex Maximus has arrived to make his selection. You watch from behind your mother's robes as the highest priest in Rome examines the gathered children. His eyes scan each face with clinical precision. When his gaze falls upon you, time stops. He raises his staff and speaks the words that will destroy your childhood forever. This one serves Vesta. Your mother collapses to her knees weeping. Your father stands frozen, knowing that refusing means death for the entire family. You don't understand why everyone is crying. You've just been chosen for the highest honor a Roman girl can receive. What you don't realize is that you've been sentenced to 30 years of sacred terror, followed by punishments so horrific that death would seem merciful. Before diving into these forgotten stories of suffering and survival, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. Today, we're going to uncover the 3 most horrific punishments that awaited Rome's Vestal virgins. What you're about to hear isn't taught in any classroom because the reality was too disturbing for sanitized history books. These weren't just religious ceremonies gone wrong. They were systematic torture methods designed to control women through fear, disguised as divine justice. The selection of a Vestal virgin wasn't an honor. It was a kidnapping sanctioned by the state and blessed by the gods. The requirements were specific and chilling. The candidate had to be between 6 and 10 years old, with both parents alive, born of Roman citizens, and free from any physical defect. She needed to be the product of a legally valid marriage, symbolically perfect in every way. But here's what most people don't realize about this selection process. Families actively hid their daughters when the Pontifex Maximus made his rounds. They would send girls to relatives in distant provinces, claim sudden illnesses, or even temporarily disfigure them with cosmetics to make them unsuitable. The selection wasn't celebrated, it was feared. When a girl was chosen, the transformation began immediately. She was taken from her family that same day, never to return home again. Her birth name was erased and replaced with a title that marked her as property of the goddess Vesta. She couldn't inherit from her family, couldn't own property in her own name, and couldn't even write letters without supervision. The house of Vestals, where she would live for 3 decades, was described by ancient writers as the most beautiful prison ever built. Located in the Roman Forum adjacent to the Temple of Vesta, it featured marble columns, ornate gardens, and luxurious furnishings. But luxury couldn't disguise the reality that she was now a prisoner whose every movement was monitored by senior Vestals and priests. Her education began with learning the 3 sacred laws that would govern every moment of her remaining life. First, perpetual virginity for 30 years, with no possibility of marriage or physical intimacy. Second, absolute obedience to the Pontifex Maximus and senior religious authorities. Third, constant guardianship of the sacred flame that supposedly kept Rome itself alive. These weren't suggestions or guidelines. They were laws backed by punishments that made Roman crucifixions look humane. The young girl learned that her body no longer belonged to her. It belonged to Rome. And Rome had very specific ideas about what happened to women who failed in their duties. The Vestal was told that she was sacred, chosen by the gods, blessed above all other women in the empire. What they didn't tell her was that this sacred status made her punishments even more brutal. Because she was holy, she couldn't be executed like a common criminal. Instead, Rome had developed specialized torture methods that preserved her sanctity while destroying her humanity. Ancient sources describe new Vestals weeping for months after their selection, begging to return home, refusing to eat until forced. Senior Vestals would tell them that resistance was futile, that the goddess had chosen them, and that their suffering was part of their sacred duty. But the real message was simpler and more terrifying. You belong to us now, forever. The psychological conditioning was systematic and complete. The girl learned that her worth as a person depended entirely on her performance as a Vestal. Any mistake, any moment of doubt, any sign of human weakness could trigger punishment that would make her long for death. But death wasn't allowed. She was too sacred to kill and too valuable to release. This sacred status became the foundation for punishments so creative in their cruelty that they've been studied by modern psychologists as examples of institutionalized psychological warfare. Rome had perfected the art of destroying a person's spirit while keeping their body alive to continue suffering. If you thought being selected as a Vestal Virgin was the worst part of the story, you haven't heard about what happened when they made their first mistake. The sacred flame in the Temple of Vesta was supposed to burn eternally, representing Rome's divine protection and eternal existence. If that flame ever went out, it wasn't just considered a religious failure. It was treated as an act of treason against the Roman state. When the flame died, the investigation began immediately. The Pontifex Maximus would interrogate each Vestal individually, searching for signs of negligence, distraction, or moral corruption that might have caused this catastrophe. The questioning could last for days, with the suspect isolated in a windowless chamber beneath the temple, deprived of food and sleep until she confessed to some failing. But confession was just the beginning. The punishment was called the verberatio, and it took place in absolute darkness in the depths of the temple complex. The condemned Vestal would be stripped naked and bound to a wooden frame designed specifically for this purpose. The Pontifex Maximus himself would administer the beating, using consecrated rods that had been blessed in Vesta's name. The beating wasn't random violence. It was a carefully orchestrated ritual designed to inflict maximum pain while preserving the Vestal's sacred status. She couldn't be allowed to scream, because her voice was considered holy. A leather gag would be placed in her mouth, muffling any sounds of agony. She couldn't be allowed to bleed, visibly, because her blood was consecrated. The rods were designed to cause internal bruising and organ damage without breaking the skin. Ancient medical texts describe Vestals who died days later from internal injuries sustained during verberatio, but the official cause of death was always listed as sudden illness or divine displeasure, never as punishment-related injuries. The beatings were conducted in such secrecy that most Romans never knew they occurred. The psychological warfare was as brutal as the physical torture. The Vestal never knew when the next flame inspection would occur. She lived in constant terror that a draft might extinguish the fire, or that her attention might wander for just a moment. This chronic fear created what modern psychologists would recognize as severe anxiety disorders that manifested in physical symptoms throughout her body. Historical records describe Vestals who developed tremors, lost their hair from stress, and aged decades in the span of months following their first verberatio. The trauma wasn't just physical, it was a systematic destruction of their sense of safety and self-worth that made them more compliant for future decades of service. But the most insidious aspect of this punishment was its randomness. The sacred flame could die from natural causes, completely beyond any Vestal's control. A sudden wind, a structural problem with the temple, or even sabotage by enemies could extinguish it. But responsibility always fell on the Vestals, and punishment was always inevitable. Some historical accounts suggest that the flame was deliberately extinguished by authorities who wanted to punish particular Vestals for political reasons or personal grudges. The religious pretext gave them perfect cover for what was essentially state-sanctioned torture of defenseless women. The recovery process was deliberately prolonged to maximize psychological impact. The injured Vestal would be tended by temple physicians who had been instructed to provide minimal care, ensuring that her recovery was slow and painful. She would be reminded daily that her suffering was deserved, that she had failed in her sacred duty, and that only perfect service going forward might prevent future punishment. This created a cycle of trauma and compliance that lasted for decades. Vestals who survived verberatio became completely subservient, terrified of showing any sign of independence or individuality that might trigger another round of punishment. They transformed from human beings into hollow shells that performed their duties with mechanical precision while their spirits slowly died inside. If you think ritualized beatings were Rome's most creative form of cruelty, you haven't heard about their solution for Vestals accused of the ultimate transgression. The charge was called incestum, meaning pollution or defilement, and it referred to any suspected violation of a Vestal's vow of chastity. The punishment for incestum wasn't execution. It was something far worse. The case of Opimia and Floronia in 216 BCE provides the most detailed account of this horror. According to the historian Livy, both women were accused of breaking their vows of chastity based on nothing more than gossip and political rivalry. Their trial, if it can be called that, was conducted in complete secrecy by the College of Pontiffs. No defense was permitted. No evidence was required beyond accusations from anonymous sources. When the verdict was announced, the condemned Vestal was told she would be returned to the earth from which all life springs. This poetic language disguised a punishment so horrific that it defied human comprehension. The ritual began at dawn with a procession through the Roman Forum. The condemned Vestal was dressed in a white bridal gown, her hair arranged in the style of a new bride, flowers woven into her veil. To observers who didn't know the truth, she might have looked like she was going to her wedding. In a sense, she was. She was being married to death. The procession moved slowly through the streets of Rome, allowing citizens to witness what happened to women who defied sacred law. But the Vestal wasn't allowed to speak, to cry, or to show any emotion. Her mouth was sealed with wax to prevent any final words that might create sympathy among the crowd. The destination was the Campus Sceleratus, the Field of the Wicked, located just outside the city walls. There, workers had spent days preparing her final resting place. A chamber had been carved into the earth, accessed by a narrow staircase that would be sealed forever once she descended. Inside the underground chamber, Rome demonstrated its twisted sense of mercy. A bed was provided, along with a small lamp, a loaf of bread, a jug of water, and a cup of milk. The official justification was that Rome wasn't executing the Vestal. They were simply placing her in isolation and allowing the gods to determine her fate. The food and water proved they weren't committing murder. This was legal fiction at its most cruel. The provisions